Well, I'm glad to be here with you again today in this series of studies from the Acts of the Apostles. And in the last message, I finished in the middle of chapter 22 of the Acts of the Apostles, because what happened was that in Jerusalem, when Paul is challenged, first of all, by the commander of the forces, of the soldiers, first of all, the question was to the commander, he said, "Do you speak Greek?" And then the commander is questioning what nationality that Paul is questioning, whether he's an Egyptian. And this is still in chapter 21. Paul answered in verse 20, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city." So he was then allowed to speak to the people. And in the beginning of chapter 2, as you remember, he was speaking in Aramaic. It's quite interesting, because when the people heard him speaking in Aramaic, they listened. And then he gives his testimony. So at the end of his testimony, and he's explaining about his conversion and what happened, then immediately the Lord actually said to him, "Leave Jerusalem." This is in verse 18 of 22. When he returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I felt that I saw the Lord speaking, and the Lord said to me, "Leave Jerusalem immediately, because they will not accept your testimony." And in verse 19, he replied to the Lord, "These men know I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believed in you, Lord. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval." And in verse 21, then the Lord spoke clearly to Paul and said, "Go." That means leave Jerusalem. I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Now, by the time we come to verse 22, the crowd listened to Paul until he said this last statement. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him, he's not fit to live." And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the commander ordered Paul to be taken into the military barracks. Then he directed that he be flogged and questioned in order to find out why the people were shouting at him. Now, this is where it gets very interesting, because in verse 25, as they literally stretched him out and bound him to flog him, Paul said to the centurion, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" So his first defense is that he is a Jew of the highest order. Now he's claiming he is a Roman citizen. So in verse 26, when the centurion heard this, he went to the commander, reported, and said, "What are you going to do? This man's a Roman citizen." So in verse 27, the commander went to Paul himself and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he answered, "Yes." The commander said, "I had to pay a big price for my citizenship." Paul says, "I was born a citizen." Now, this is very interesting, because Paul he's already confessed in his testimony he was born in Tarsus. He was very much the son of a Jewish, very Orthodox Jewish family. He was a Pharisee, as it shows in his testimony. But the commander is questioning how Paul, from Tarsus, Cilicia, Turkey in modern terms, could be a Roman citizen. And we discover that what happened was that Tarsus had become taken over as a fully Roman city and given all the rights and privileges. And therefore, because Paul was born around at the same time that Jesus was born, he was born in Tarsus, a Roman citizen. Therefore, he was born a Roman citizen. So this does present quite a different situation. So by the time Paul says in verse 28 of chapter 22, I was born as a citizen, in verse 29, those who were about to question him withdrew, and the commander was alarmed when he realized that he'd put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. Because Roman citizens had the right to sue and be sued in the courts, and the right to have a legal trial when they could appear before a proper court. They even had the ability, which Paul eventually uses, to appeal to Caesar himself. Now, I've discovered, and it's very clear, that the law said that a Roman citizen could not be tortured or whipped or scourged, nor could they receive the death penalty unless they were guilty of treason. So you understand that actually Paul is now trying to save his life. So his appeal as a Roman citizen meant they couldn't flog him. Right. Verse 30. The next day, since the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. Chapter 23 comes a little bit further because Paul looked at the Sanhedrin and said, brothers, my brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all conscience to this day. When he said it, the high priest, Ananias, ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. What an accusation against the high priest. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourselves violate the law by commanding that I should be struck. But it then infuriates the others who were standing near Paul and said, how do you dare insult God's high priest? Paul's reply was, brothers, I didn't realize he was the high priest, for it's written, do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.